Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today I'm going to be doing a tournament report on a Pauper Win a Duel event that I just went to this past Saturday. This was at Through the Decades, a card store in Louisville, Kentucky, which is about 2 hours from where I live, and I figured it'd be fun to do my best to try to win a tropical island, which was first prize, second place Badlands, and third through eighth place got store credit. I've been trying to go to more in-person events because it's something I enjoy doing, and this is the exact type of event that I usually would have skipped without a second thought, and I figured let's actually try to go this time, especially because the prizes were great for a very reasonable entry fee. So if we're going to go play Pauper at a competitive event, we got to figure out what to play, and my thought process went a little something like this. Let's play Black Sack. I don't play that many decks competitively. I play a ton of decks overall, but the main ones that I'm comfortable with are Black Sack, Esper Affinity, Jund Wildfire, and Dimir Fairies. There's already usually quite a bit of Jund Wildfire at these type of events. I don't really love playing that mirror match, and people are going to be coming prepared to play against it, so I don't really like being in the spotlight, the type of deck that people are 100% anticipating seeing. Esper Affinity, while it's a deck that I really love, and I'm trying to get it into a better competitive spot, it hasn't currently turned up quite the results that I've wanted in challenges, and so it's not the deck that I want to bring if I really want to win. That left Dimir Fairies and Black Sack, and frankly I think either of these decks would have been a pretty good choice for me, but I ended up picking Black Sack. Now, why did I pick Black Sack? There's a few different reasons. The first one is the deck is extremely powerful. It has the potential for turn 3 wins. Those are not extremely common, but turn 4 wins are not that hard to find. It's very resilient to a lot of the removal and just general archetypes that people are playing in the format. And if you don't make very many mistakes and are able to use all of your cards effectively, I think it can legitimately be one of the most powerful decks in the entire format. It's also extremely underrated. Not only am I just saying this because more people should be playing the deck, but this means that people are not going to be bringing cards to defeat us in their sideboards. They're not necessarily even going to anticipate us being at large events like this, and they might not have even played against the deck very much, so they might not know how to play against it efficiently, which is something that actually came up a couple of times throughout the day. The deck is just also really hard to sideboard against. We go wide, so Breath Weapons and End the Festivities, Arms of Hadar can be good against us, but we also go tall, so you need single target removal, preferably unconditional like Cast Down. We use the graveyard just a little bit, so Relics of Progenitus and Nile Spellbombs don't really hurt us too much, but might be something you'd want to bring in to get rid of our supernatural stamina or unearth value. We play a very minimal amount of artifacts and enchantments, so the 4 or 5 slots in the sideboards dedicated to those don't affect us. We're not blue or red, so the 8 Pyroblast and Hydroblasts in our opponent's sideboards are completely irrelevant against us. And a lot of main deck removal like Snuff Out and edicts like Tithing Blade are just really bad against us. So it's really tough for our opponent, even if they do know what they're doing against the matchup, to actually have the proper cards to deal with what we're doing. The next reason I brought this deck is, and I think this is the most important thing for whatever deck you're bringing, no matter what it is, I know this deck extremely well. I know it like the back of my hand. When I'm writing my deck list down for registration, I don't even need to look at my deck list to know exactly what it is. I have the 75 cards memorized. That's because I've played hundreds of matches with it on MTGO and in person, and obviously I've written a very big guide on it. So I've deliberated over every single card choice very carefully, as well as the exact number of those cards. So I also know how likely it is for me to draw a certain card at a certain time, so I can try to play into those cards as good top decks. And finally, and maybe more importantly, it's just so fun. Black Sack is a ton of fun to play. That's not necessarily the most important factor for winning a big tournament like this, but even if you lose, it's the best way to make sure that you had a good time regardless. These are the benefits I think that Black Sack has specifically, but as long as you have a powerful deck that you know well, you're probably going to be in an okay spot for a big tournament like this. I couldn't find any exact metadata posted by the game store after the event, but based on looking around and who I played against, this is what I was able to ascertain was being played at the event. There were 33 players total. 32 players would have meant we play 5 rounds before cutting to top 8. 33 players meant we did 6 rounds and then cut to top 8. But as far as I could tell, there was at least 1 Azorius Familiars player, 2 Black Sack, 4 Blue Terror, 1 Dimir Terror, 2 Elves, a Golgari Gardens, 3 Grixis Affinity, 2 Jeskai Ephemerate, 3 Jund Wildfire, Orzhov Glintblade, Persistent Petitioner Mill, 2 Red Madness, a Red Rally, and a White Weenie. 8 other decks that I just probably didn't see or didn't catch. I wasn't taking specific notes because I wasn't even sure I was going to do a report on this. This is just what I could remember off the top of my head. Looking at this, the biggest thing that stands out for me is that there was very little combo here at all. The last big event that I went to had a whole bunch of Spy, Dredge, and Cycle Storm, and here I basically saw no full-on combo decks. This is not necessarily a good thing for Black Sack. Black Sack preys upon a lot of combo decks really easily because if they're a slow combo deck, something like Tron, it's usually very easy for us to steamroll them. If it's a faster combo deck like Spy or Walls, then we can often race them. And those decks that are very creature dependent, we have a lot of removal to deal with their creatures, and they have to start chump blocking, which loses them resources very quickly. That said, Terror was the most represented deck that I saw, which is one of our best matchups, but Grixis Affinity and Jund Wildfire are right below Blue Terror as the most prevalent deck, and those are some of our worst matchups because of Card Clan Shaman and Toxin Analysis. So overall, if I had seen this meta beforehand, I still might bring Black Sack. I don't think it looks terrible into this meta, but there might have been something better that I could have played. Here's a quick glimpse at the deck list. This is my stock deck list right here that I have a 60-page guide written about. If you're interested in that, check the link in the description. My in-paper list actually has one minor difference, which is that I play 3 Mesmeric Fiend and 3 Tragic Slip instead of 2 and 4. The reason for that is that my local meta does not have very much combo, which worked out really well for this event, playing fewer Mesmeric Fiends, and an extra Tragic Slip is just really, really, really good. Tragic Slip is phenomenal. I've honestly been wanting to find more room for it online, but of course, combo's a little more prevalent there. Otherwise, except for maybe a sideboard slot or 2, I am still extremely happy with this main deck list. There's nothing that I have been wanting to change, and everything always feels really clean to me. Before we get into the exact rounds, let's talk mulligans. I have an entire video dedicated to talking about mulligans, so if you haven't checked that out before, there's a link for that in the description as well. But in general, what am I looking for in an opening hand? That's 1 to 3 lands and a solid game plan. Now, this is a little vague. The 1 to 3 lands is really dependent on exactly what's in your hand. 2 or 3 lands you can probably keep most reasonable hands with those. 1 land you need to have a more cohesive game plan or an idea of how to get another land. And as far as a solid game plan in general, 80% of the time this is going to mean having some growers, having some fodder, and being able to attack with those growers as you sacrifice your fodder. This is a 1 land hand, but it's totally reasonable because you have Village Rites, which really makes it easier to keep a 1 land hand. You have Shambling Ghast, which can give you a treasure, a little bit extra mana, also makes it easier. But to be honest, I've also started keeping quite a few more 1 land hands, even if they don't have a Village Rites or a Shambler. I'm not saying keep every 1 land hand that you draw. There are tons of bad ones. But if I have like a Carrion Feeder, 2 Beetles, a Rite of Consumption, 2 pieces of fodder, and a swamp, that's an incredible hand. It might fall behind if you don't hit another land, but assuming you can stick some of those creatures, the feeders and the beetles are going to grow enormously with those fodder. Even if you're stuck on 1 land, you might be able to present like a turn 6 win with that hand, which is really not bad at all, and that's probably through some chump blockers. The other 20%, maybe even less of the time, the opening hand that you're going to keep that's a solid game plan is just a bunch of card draw and fodder. You don't want these hands as much as you want a more aggressive hand. I would gladly swap out any of these Village Rites for a Carrion Feeder, a Vampire, or even a Beetle, which can grow to the other Village Rites. But this hand is okay in certain matchups. I would never keep this hand if I'm playing against someone where I'm trying to race, against Mono Red Madness, Red Rally, Elves, Walls. This hand that just draws cards doesn't do anything good. I'm not keeping that hand. But a match that's bound to go long because they have a lot of chump blockers and probably don't finish the game very quickly themselves, something like White Weenie or Blue Fairies, this is an acceptable hand. You're already not going to be getting a turn 3 or 4 win against White Weenie almost ever because they're going to have chump blockers and prismatic strands and removal, but drawing a bunch of cards can make it so that you can have more advantage for that inevitable late game. So if I'm in the dark, not knowing what my opponent's on, I might keep this hand. If I'm like on the play, it's probably better. If I know what my opponent's on, only if I think that the game's going to go long enough and I don't need to race really quickly. Now let's get into the specific rounds. So round 1, I sat down and my opponent told me that they had never played Pauper before. This was their first time. However, they were certainly no stranger to Magic as they had just participated in the Pro Tour in July. So I probably had a leg up on them for knowing the format, but probably was playing against a player better than myself in general, as I've never made the Pro Tour. Things to keep in mind against a Dimir Terror opponent. Counterspells. You want to try to play around Spell Pierce, Force Spike, things like that when you can, and certainly don't cast a spell that you really need to resolve into counterspell mana if you don't have something else to follow it up with. It's a lot like playing against Mono Blue Terror, except they have 3 or 4 cast downs, which are much better against us than anything Mono Blue Terror has, but they also have 4 snuff outs, which are basically dead cards and makes things a lot better for us. So they have a little bit better removal, but not very much of it. They're also not going to be able to get a fast Delver start because they don't play Delvers. Instead, they could have a Snacker, but that's going to be a lot less aggressive and something that we can certainly play around and shouldn't lose to very often. Fodder is very key in any Terror matchup. You need to have enough fodder to be able to chump block the Terrors several turns in a row if possible while you're growing your own creatures or drawing cards or what have you. I'm going to do my best throughout this whole video to relay what happened in each game, obviously, but I didn't take any notes and found that even though it's been only a day or two, a lot of the specifics have already faded a little bit. So I might try to take more notes in the future, but I'm certainly going to be summarizing some things, and there are some matches where I might forget some major parts of the games. Starting off with Dimir Terror, they didn't really do a lot. They cast a lot of Thought Scours early, and around turn 4 or 5 ended up landing 3 terrors on the field. But the notable thing was that they did not have any black mana. By turn 6, they had 6 islands and no black mana at all, which meant it was a lot easier for me to go all in on my creatures, my beetles and my carrion feeders, because I knew that there was not a cast down coming. Because even if they get black mana, most of the time these decks don't play more than 1 swamp. Everything else is a tapped black land. So I knew I would have an extra turn buffer before any removal would actually be coming down. They did land 3 terrors in the mid game, which can be scary. We honestly just had a bunch of generic creatures on the field ourselves, lots of fodder, a beetle and a vampire, and we had 1 mercenary from a Nezumi Linkbreaker and like 2 or 3 nested shamblers in our hand. So we kept using the mercenary to pump the shambler, sacrifice it to a vampire, grow the beetle, make 2 squirrels. We did that several times to the point where their 3 terrors could not attack in. I chumped them a few times, but then I suddenly had 10 creatures on board, a beetle, a vampire, and like 8 pieces of fodder, and they had to leave all 3 of their terrors back. As I was developing my creatures, I was also probing for counterspells. I did forget to mention they force spiked a Nezumi Linkbreaker on turn 1. Now that I knew that that was in their deck, I tried to play around it as much as I can, and I tried to probe for actual counterspells with Bloodthorn Vampire and Mortician Beetle, but they don't cast any counterspells, so I assume that their entire hand is just stocked with black spells that they can't deploy. The next couple turns, they kind of just draw go, not really developing anything more. We get a Snuff Out that we're able to use to pick off 1 of the terrors, and I attack him with the beetle and the vampire, as well as like 8 of our fodder creatures. They do some quick math and decide just to block the vampire. They are at 18 life after all. However, my Mortician Beetle, sacrificing everything on board except for the 1/1s that are attacking, my beetle becomes a 13/13, and my extra 5 fodder creatures hit him for a full 18 damage, and we're able to take the game. Seeing as it was their first time playing Pauper, I'm sure they're not familiar with the Black Sack deck and did not realize quite how much damage I could deal there. To be honest though, if they had chump blocked the beetle with their other terror, they simply would have lost next turn. Wouldn't have made a big difference either way. And in game 2, you want to keep in mind that they're going to have additional Suffocating Fumes and or Arms of Hadar to shrink all of your creatures. Try not to go quite as wide and always have a sack outlet so that you can condense those into one big creature if they do happen to get that board wipe. They also often might have an Extract a Confession though, which is kind of opposite of be mindful of going all in on one creature. It's a little bit of a push and pull. You just need to play around those cards that you think that they might have when they might have them. They were of course on the play and led with a Contaminated Aquifer. I had 2 Carrion Feeders in my hand, and I knew a cast down was the main removal they were going to have, so I just led with a Carrion Feeder. If they cast it down, so be it, but they were going to be able to do that at some point anyway. Even if they had an Extract a Confession, they would be able to collect evidence, and I couldn't really protect the first feeder, so I figured I might as well have the benefit of going really aggressive if I wanted to. And on their turn 2, they cast a Mental Note, milling 2, and did not hit a land. They passed, keeping a 1-lander, which meant that we wanted to go very aggressive. I play a Swamp, I sadistically onto my Carrion Feeder, and then play a Link Breaker, sacking both it and the Mercenary right away to attack for 5. On their turn, they cast another Mental Note, passing again without another land drop. We play an Infestation Sage and our second Carrion Feeder. I sack the Sage, attacking for 7 with the Feeder, putting them to 8, leaving the insect around because I figure we already have lethal on them next turn, might as well not go too all in case they do get the removal spell, which they do. They finally top deck an island, play that, cast down our big Carrion Feeder in our upkeep, as they certainly should. We sack it to our other feeder. I think we play another piece of fodder, attack them for like 4-ish. They don't really draw anything else relevant. Finally abandoning attachments, discarding just a random card, and quickly concede. They did keep a sketchy second hand, but the first hand was pretty reasonable and they just didn't get there with the black mana. Definitely a bit unlucky for them overall. That means we're 1-0, and going into round 2, we play against White Weenie. Against White Weenie, you want to keep in mind, your opponent is going to have 4 Thraben Charms. Often they can get enough creatures to deal, 10 damage to your grower, and you can't keep it alive. Definitely, you'll just have to deal with that at some point. But in the early turns, try not to have a grower on the field that they can pick off on turn 2 or 3, where the Thraben Charm is only going to be dealing 2 or 4 damage. Try to make sure that you have enough fodder to keep your creature alive through that. They also play some Journey to Nowhere in the main deck sometimes, and there it's often a difficult choice if you want to sacrifice your grower to itself, which would allow you to unearth it later, but it would also allow them to bounce the Journey to Nowhere back to their hand with a Core Skyfisher and reuse it. So definitely just really depends on the context there. If you think they might have a Core Skyfisher, or if you know you have it unearthed, can definitely change that a little bit. Prismatic Strands is very important to play around. If your opponent has 3 open mana, or obviously just Strands in the graveyard, you really do not want to go all in on your Bloodthorn Vampire because you're sacrificing a bunch of fodder for no gain. And Rite of Consumption gets stopped by Prismatic Strands, so never cast that into 3 open mana. You are generally going to be the aggressor in the match, but if your opponent happens to amass enough creatures, which they often will, just be aware that they could have a Guardian's Pledge to pump their whole team, and try to make sure you have enough of your chump blockers back to not die to a simple +2/+2. It's really easy to avoid, assuming they haven't played like 2 Battle Screeches, so that's just something to keep in mind as well. Game 1, they definitely don't have the best start ever. They basically just play a whole bunch of Inspectors. They eventually play a Skyfisher, bouncing an Inspector, but I snuff it out pretty quickly, and they get Assault Road Pack Beast down as well, which is more or less just a big Inspector. Meanwhile, I have a pretty standard early game just playing out some fodder, a Beetle and a Vampire. They continue every single turn to not leave up mana for Prismatic Strands or clues or anything like that, which makes it really easy for me to attack in with my Mortician Beetle. I also had a Carrion Feeder at this point, both of which were about 5/5s. With some more fodder on the board, they were warranting at least 1 chump block every turn. And for some reason, I had gotten in my head that I needed to leave back my Vampire, even though I had about 10 creatures on board. I was nowhere near death, even with a Guardian's Pledge. I definitely wasted a turn or two not attacking with the Vampire that I should have been, which could have been eating additional creatures every single turn, because it could have far and away been lethal way earlier. And again, I wasn't worried about a Prismatic Strands, otherwise it makes sense to leave the Vampire at home. They end up with a couple Lunarch Veterans. They chump block as long as they can, but they never get any cards to pull ahead. No Guardian's Pledges, Battle Screeches, or anything like that. So they chump block as long as they can, and eventually they can't block everything, and I sack my whole board to deal them lethal damage. Game 2, you should be worried about the same cards, of course, Prismatic Strands being really key. They might have more Journey to Nowheres in their sideboard if they even had any in the main deck, so that's something to keep in mind. Destroy Evil is a card they might have access to as well, so sometimes keeping your growers at like 3 power and toughness can be something to keep in mind if they've conspicuously left up 2 mana. And Holy Light is their only access to a board wipe. It's not necessarily the most devastating thing ever, but it can certainly get you and wipe several of your little creatures, or even wipe away some beetles if you don't have a way to sacrifice a creature in response. So it's things to keep in mind. This time they mulliganed to 5, and I kept a 7, so it was a bit unlucky for them. No 1-drop at all, and then they turn to a Rafine's Informant and a Prismatic Strands binned into the graveyard. Not a bad start for them for sure. On our turn 1, we played a Nested Shambler. Turn 2, I have in hand a Bloodthorn Vampire that I'd be happy to play this turn, but I also have a Stamina and a Village Rites. There's no reason to waste a potential damage, so I just attack in with the Nested Shambler here. Their Informant, of course, is a 3/2, so they know if they block, there might be some sort of trick. But my goal here is to either deal 1 damage, which is small but worthy goal, or if I'm really lucky, get them to use the Prismatic Strands by buffing my own Shambler. And that's exactly what happens. They block with the Informant, I go for a Stamina, suddenly my guys got 3 power, so our guys are going to trade, and they flash back the Strands to keep their Informant alive, and I even then get to Village Rites my Shambler, gaining 3 squirrels, drawing 2 cards, and bringing the Shambler back. Meanwhile, getting rid of the single card I'm most scared of in their entire deck. Ends up working out really well for me, but to be honest, they also mulligan to 5. They do get quite flooded, but we end up landing a Vampire the following turn, which they Journey to Nowhere. We're just attacking in with all of our 1/1s, sacrificing the one that they block with a Village Rites, and eventually they tap 5 mana to cast Assault Road Pack Beast. Definitely not where they want to be. We end up landing another Carrion Feeder and Beetle, and with all the fodder we have on board, we're able to grow them pretty quickly and efficiently. They don't find any more removal, and after a couple chump blocks, we're able to take down that match as well. Round 3, we're against Elves. This is generally a match that I don't think is super favored for us. However, the more removal I've ended up adding into our sideboard, the more I think it's an okay match post-sideboard. Game 1 is definitely a tough one if you don't end up drawing one of your Snuff Outs or maybe a Shambling Ghast. The thing to keep in mind is if you get your removal, you want to kill Timberwatch Elf first. That card's going to kill you just by itself. Priest of Titania is also really scary and important to kill. And of course, Aquarian Ranger doubles these effects. So theoretically, if you have a Shambling Ghast and they have a Timberwatch and Aquarian, you can kill the Aquarian, if not the Timberwatch Elf. So these are the 3 most important creatures to pick off. Game 1, they just start with a pretty generic start. A Mana Dork Elves on turn 1, and then another an Aquarian Ranger turn 2. I believe I won the die roll here, so I started with a Link Breaker into not knowing what they were on. Then once I saw the Elves, Beetle and Feeder to try to start going more aggressive. Was able to sacrifice the Link Breaker to make these a little bigger, getting a Mercenary so that I can pump our Shambler, and then a Sage, which we deploy the following turn. Not a terrible start for us, but unfortunately, we don't find any of our removal. They lead the Stampede, revealing a Priest of Titania, Avenging Hunter, and a Fyndhorn Elves, I believe, playing the Fyndhorn and the Priest. So I know the Avenging Hunter is coming pretty soon. Still attacking in with the Mortician Beetle and the Carrion Feeder. I do get them down to 7 life, and surprisingly, this is an Elves opponent that started chump blocking very early on. I believe I got them to about 15 before they started chump blocking. Just one of our growers every turn, so they were still taking some damage, but usually Elves players are very hesitant to chump block until they absolutely need to. This player did say that Black Sack is their second deck that they thought about bringing for the tournament, so it's possible they're familiar with the Rite of Consumption game and we're trying to keep a healthy life total to avoid dying to it, which makes a lot of sense. So they have to chump block a little bit more, but then the next turn they land an Avenging Hunter and a Well-Wisher. It also didn't end up mattering, but I did have the fun interaction of having to tell my opponent that their Priest of Titania actually made 1 additional mana because my Infestation Sage was an elf. I kind of forgot about it until they tapped the Priest, and then I quickly sacrificed my Infestation Sage so that the Priest would stop making additional mana. But I also sacked the Sage because they played the Avenging Hunter and I needed the Flyer. Luckily for me, they didn't have any reach here, and their Well-Wisher didn't yet have the ability to tap. So the following turn, I attacked with my Beetle, Feeder, and the Insect from the Infestation Sage. I think they had a couple Masked Vandals that they had thrown out knowing they weren't really going to hit anything, that they were able to chump block both the Beetle and the Feeder with, but they had to take the one from the Insect, dropping to 6 life, giving us the initiative. Although we already had 3 or 4 swamps, it wasn't really relevant for us at the time, and we landed a Bloodthrone Vampire. They're at 6 life, we have 3 big growers and a flying creature. I was feeling pretty good. Then they tapped Priest for 5 mana, untapped it with Aquarian Ranger, and retapped it, and cast a Nyxborn Hydra for a total of 11 on the Avenging Hunter. They attacked just with that creature. It's a 16 power trampler, and I was at exactly 16 life. However, I obviously had a bunch of chump blockers to throw in front of it. Problem was, they were at 6 life with a Well-Wisher and Aquarian Ranger that they could use again on our turn, gaining them an additional 10 life. So they were attacking me for 16. I needed to be able to deal them 16 to be able to win the game. So I threw a Nezumi Linkbreaker in front of the Hydra, chumping for just 1 damage, going down to 1 life. They took back the initiative, throwing a couple counters on some random elf that didn't make a difference. And I realized my only way out of this, because they had blockers for all of my creatures, and even if I top decked a Sadistically for my Insect, they could have either untapped the Hunter to block it, and the Insect just couldn't deal 16 damage by itself. I had 7 creatures I could sacrifice to the Bloodthrone Vampire to make it a 15 power creature, so a Rite of Consumption would have dealt 15 damage, and luckily I did have the Insect that could fly over, and just enough creatures that I could ping in for at least 1 or 2 little bits of damage. So my only out was to top deck the Rite of Consumption at that exact time, and we did. Very lucky. No other card was going to win us the game, and we were certainly going to lose to the Hydra next turn. Or if not next turn, I could have sacrificed all of our creatures to go in on the Vampire to block the Hydra. That would have killed us the following turn, not to mention the Well-Wisher would have gained them more life the following turn. So there was no way I would be able to come back if I did not top deck perfectly, and we got a little lucky and found the 2 outer. Game 2 for Elves doesn't change much as far as what to keep in mind. They don't have a lot of sideboard cards for us, in my experience, but we get a lot of sideboard cards for them. 3 Tragic Slips, a Spinning Darkness, 2 Drown in Sorrow, all going to be targeted at Timberwatch Elf, Priest of Titania, and Aquarian Ranger. So generally these games get a lot easier post-sideboard. But we do find a pretty sketchy hand that I decide to keep. Bloodthrone Vampire, Unearth, double Village Rites, and a Snuff Out. So we have a little bit of removal, and if we get 1 piece of fodder, of which I have 14 in the deck, we get not only 2 pieces of fodder, like a Nezumi Linkbreaker we can unearth, our Bloodthrone Vampire could easily be a 9/9 if needed, and we have a bunch of card draw to find more things. So this is a sketchy hand. It's not one that I would always recommend keeping. If you need 1 card from your deck, and that card is specifically a Rite of Consumption for your hand to be good, don't keep it. You're not going to get one of those 2 cards very often. But if you need 1 card out of 14 potential ones, I think you can often keep that hand. They play a Forest and a Fyndhorn Elves. I top deck a Swamp, play a Swamp and pass. They play a Forest and a Timberwatch Elf. We draw a Swamp, play my Bloodthrone Vampire, snuff out the Timberwatch Elf. They play some other elves, maybe they lead the Stampede. Doesn't matter. My top deck, Village Rites, my 3rd copy. I play a Swamp, attack with my Vampire, sacrifice it to a Village Rites, top deck 2 more Swamps. And then the following turn, I top deck a Swamp. So here's the thing. This hand did not end up working out, but also no matter what the hand was, unless it was like Drown in Sorrow to get a ton of value, I'm losing almost every game where I top deck 5 Swamps and a Village Rites in a row without any fodder in hand. So the fact that these were both in the same game was actually a little lucky, because these could have been 2 bad different games. I could have drawn fine cards, but just none of them being fodder, and this hand still would have fallen apart. And I could have had a really good hand and then drawn these 6 cards in a row and had a really bad start. Although if we had fodder to like turbo through these Swamps with the Village Rites, maybe we'd be okay, but we lose very quickly game 2 to Elves. They do whatever they do, and I concede pretty quickly. But then in game 3, we get the opposite. We get the perfect opening hand. It has a Snuff Out, a Drown in Sorrow, and a Tragic Slip. So a little bit of early removal to pick off the problematic cards, and once they start trying to overwhelm our single target removal, we get to Drown in Sorrow to clean up the board. They don't even have a very good start. Fyndhorn Elves into, I think maybe Timberwatch Elf, but I get to Tragic Slip it right away. They get Aquarian Ranger. Eventually they get a Priest of Titania. I snuff that out, but we have growers along the way. I don't even end up having to cast the Drown in Sorrow because we're able to take the game so quickly. So just like that, we're on to round 3, currently 3-0. Playing against Red Rally. You want to keep in mind that Red Rally has Lightning Bolts and Galvanic Blasts. Do your best to keep your growers out of range of those dying. And they also have a lot of explosive haste threats. Generally, you want to leave back as much fodder as possible, not doing chip damage in this one because you might be trading chip damage and theirs is a lot stronger than ours, especially because they have the reach from all the bolts. You want to mostly be attacking with your growers and leave everything else back. We start with a Link Breaker. They play a Tomb Raider with a Mountain, so it doesn't have haste. Then we get to play an Infestation Sage and a Carrion Feeder. This feeder can be as big as a 5/5, so it can survive even a Galvanic Blast with Metalcraft. They play an Experimental Synthesizer, flipping up a Reckless Impulse. This is turn 2, so they definitely can't cast that. They play a Mountain, play another Tomb Raider. At least the Synth is now granting +1/+0 and haste, and they swing for 4. I chump one of them with the Link Breaker and sacrifice it to the feeder. Following turn, I honestly don't remember exactly what I did. I had maybe a Village Rites to hold up or something. But on their turn, they played a Reckless Impulse into a Mountain and a Bushwhacker. So they play the Mountain, 3rd land for turn, swing in with the 2 Tomb Raiders. I block one of them with the Infestation Sage, sack it to the feeder, and take 2. They leave up a Mountain, so I'm a little wary of what they could have. But we play a Beetle, we attack in with the feeder, which gets in for 3 damage or so. And then on their turn, they play a Reckless Impulse again, turning up a Burning Tree Emissary and a Galvanic Blast. They still have a Goblin Bushwhacker from the last turn. From hand, they play a Mountain, and then they cast the Burning Tree Emissary into a Rally at the Hornburg from hand. So this is wasting the Bushwhacker, and it's not using the Galvanic Blast yet, which is fine, it can be used next turn. But this confused me a little bit thinking about it, because I realized that they had a Mountain and a Rally at the Hornburg in hand, and a Goblin Bushwhacker in exile. So they could have just played those 3 spells, as opposed to using the Impulse this turn, and they wouldn't have ended up wasting the Bushwhacker. Now for blockers, we had a 1/1 Beetle, an Insect, and a Mercenary. It didn't end up mattering which one they did, because they attack with the Burning Tree Emissary, 2 Tomb Raiders, and the 2 Human Soldiers. I block Beetle on Emissary. Both of our Insect and our Mercenary block the Tomb Raiders, and I sacrifice those to the feeder, grow the Beetle, eat the Emissary. I take 2 damage from the Rally at the Hornburg tokens. Suddenly I have 8 damage between feeder and Beetle. They're at about 14 life, and they pass the turn. So I attack them back for 8 damage, putting them to 6. Sack the Beetle to the feeder, and then I have the old Rite of Consumption to finish off the game. Game 2 against Red Rally. The only thing you really need to be worried about them bringing in usually is like an End the Festivities type card, wiping away all of your fodder. So as always, it's just nice to have an early Carrion Feeder, which can sacrifice all of those, consolidating them into a single creature, so at least you don't fully waste them. We also, of course, get to bring in our Sylvok Life Staffs, which can be a really good way to just stay above their burn and their aggro. They start with an Epicure, pinging us for 1 damage, and we start with a Nested Shambler. Then turn 2, they play a Goblin Tomb Raider, and they leave up their 2nd Mountain, not casting anything, so I'm expecting they have a Galvanic Blast or a Lightning Bolt or something. They swing in for 3, and we just take it. Then I play a Carrion Feeder and pass back to them, leaving up a black mana of my own for a Stamina. I also leave back the Shambler, so I could potentially Stamina the Shambler, block the Tomb Raider, or what I'm anticipating is that they are going to try to kill the feeder on the end step, and I can get them with the Stamina then. And that's exactly what they do. They cast a Galvanic Blast with no Metalcraft to hit the Carrion Feeder. I Stamina my Nested Shambler and then sacrifice it and 1 Squirrel to the feeder to make it a 3/3. And so now we have a 3/3 Carrion Feeder, 2 Squirrels, and a Nested Shambler. They do get an End the Festivities, which can clean up 2 of the Squirrels, which I sacrifice to the feeder, and then I let the Nested Shambler die. The feeder here is already a 5/5, so it's going to survive a Lightning Bolt, or with the Squirrel, it's going to survive against a Galvanic Blast, even with Metalcraft, which they don't currently have. So I'd rather have the Squirrel around for Village Rites and things like that. Squirrel's tapped, Carrion Feeder can't block, so they get in for 3 damage. But they honestly just don't have that much more going on for them. They eventually start leaving back the Epicure to chump the feeder, then the Tomb Raider chumps. They play a Rally and leave those creatures back to chump as my feeder gets a little bit bigger, and then I get a Link Breaker and a Bloodthorn Vampire on board. They don't really have any burn. I think they might have had a mulligan on this one. I can't remember exactly, but definitely don't have a lot going for them. Not as much card draw as the last time. And after a few chump blocks, they end up just taking lethal damage from our creatures. After the match, they also admitted that they probably never played against Black Sack, so they really were not sure how to fight against it. They even asked how I would suggest they try to beat it, to which I kindly told them to try to kill our creatures a little bit more, which can be tough, but there's no reason for me to gatekeep that kind of information. They could certainly go online and find it if they really wanted. and I just don't like to be a bad sport about it. So as soon as the match is over, I'm happy to talk about whatever my opponent wants to. Round 5 was against Golgari Gardens. Me and the Gardens players were the only undefeated players at this point, both 4-0. Going 5-1 at worst would almost assuredly get you into the top 8, so the winner of this match probably had clinched the top 8 slot. To keep in mind against Golgari Gardens, they run a ton of removal. Cast down, you want to play around if you can, but it's unconditional. You just need to not go all in on one creature if you can kind of spread it out, but just be aware that it's there for 2 mana. The rest of the removal, though, is all conditional, so you want to play around it as best you can. Defile scales, but your creatures are going to scale a lot bigger, a lot quicker. So playing a Carrion Feeder out on turn 1 can die quickly to a Defile, but playing it on turn 3, where they might only have 2 or 3 swamps, and you already have fodder to grow it out of range of that, can make it the Defiles a lot less valuable. Also, Tithing Blades are something they usually play, so making sure you have at least one, if not more, multiple buffer fodder creatures to make sure you don't have to sacrifice your Beetle to a Tithing Blade is really important. And finally, Crypt Rats. Usually you're going to try to be winning before Crypt Rats is going to come down at all, but if it does come down, it can be really problematic, wiping away not just the fodder creatures you have, but also the ones that might die into more creatures because they can put multiple triggers on the stack, and if they have enough mana, they can even just kill your growers entirely. Game 1, funnily enough, we both mulliganed to 5, so it was even ground there. They played a Colony Gardens, I think I played a Link Breaker. They passed with 2 mana up. I attacked in, they chumped with the plant and then sacrificed it to a Reckoner's Bargain. I realized that I had a Beetle I could have played before in case they were going to do that trick. That could have gotten a counter, but I also had a Bloodthorn Vampire I wanted to get down at the time, so I actually just played that as our 2-drop. They cast down my Vampire, I played a Carrion Feeder and a Beetle, they cast down one of those, they defiled one of them. They had 3 or 4 removal spells that were able to kill my creatures. I did get at least 1 Village Rites off, sacrificing 1, so that I got a little bit of value back, but eventually they finally started running out of removal. They ended up with a Wellspring and a Campfire on board at about 12 life. We had a Carrion Feeder, a Beetle, a Shambler, and a bunch of squirrels. We attacked for 11 damage. They were at 12, but they also had a Campfire and mana for a whole bunch of other things. I think I sacrificed down to just having the Shambler. I could have sacrificed that to force the issue, but they already had a Campfire up. It was very obvious they had some more stuff. I didn't want to go more all in case they had a Tithing Blade. I wanted to have the fodder in case they got a Village Rites. So I just hit for 11, and then they proceeded to activate Campfire, Reckoner's Bargain, a Wellspring, and cast a Pulse Rasa, gaining 10 life at the end of their turn. Pulse springing back, I think, a Troll of Khazad-dûm to cycle for a swamp. It was a huge burst of life that they got. Unfortunately, they didn't really find any more removal, and after about 2 more turns of attacking and the Campfire being activated, I was able to end up dealing lethal. In game 2 against Gardens, you want to keep in mind that they're going to have all the same removal as before, except for Snuff Outs, they're going to take those out. But also Drown in Sorrow, try to play around that as best you can, and also Extract a Confession. Again, those are a bit at odds. Try not to go too wide because of Drown in Sorrow, try not to go too tall because of Extracting Confession, just do your best. And Weather the Storm's a card that they could bring in. It's not a card that I think is particularly good for them to bring in, but if you're not at least aware they could be bringing it in, you might play into, oh, I'll just go all in here. They couldn't possibly have anything that can gain them 12 life, and then they gain 12 life. So I'm not worried about them bringing it in, but I am thinking about the fact that they could have it at certain times. This time I keep a 7-card hand, and they mulligan down to 5 again, but it's a decent 5. They once again have Defile, Cast Down, Cast Down. I end up with 2 Carrion Feeders and a Vampire in hand, so I turn 1 a Feeder, knowing that they could just Defile it if they have that, which is exactly what happens. And then we play some more Growers, which quickly get cast down. After another turn or 2, they've run out of single target removal, and I just vividly remember this board state. I have an Infestation Sage with a Sadistically on it and 2 counters. I very specifically sacrificed 2 of my own creatures to get the Infestation Sage to be a 3/3 so that it would avoid a Drown in Sorrow, so that if they had a Drown in Sorrow, it would wipe away everything else and grow our Sage so we'd still have 1 giant creature. We also had a Mercenary and a Squirrel and a Bloodthorn Vampire. They tap out to cast a Crypt Rats, missed a few lands, so I think just the 3 mana that they had. And I go ahead and Mercenary to pump the Vampire. They're at 10 life, so Vampire plus Mercenary, and then sacrifice Squirrel, Mercenary, Sage, and the Insect is going to be lethal, which means I know that they either have to just concede here or lose their Crypt Rats before they can actually wipe away our full board. We attack in, and they just decide to take it. I sack everything and hit them for 10, and win that game against Gardens. They then showed me that they had the Drown in Sorrow in hand, basically confirming that I was correct in playing around it, because I could have put the Sadistically on the Bloodthorn Vampire to try to make it bigger in case I got a Rite of Consumption, or to survive a Crypt Rats. I could have put it on, I could have just held the Glee longer. I think legitimately one of my best takeaways from this whole day was that I was a little more aggressive putting Sadistically on just random piece of fodder. I usually don't like putting it on an Infestation Sage, because then there's that extra flying creature underneath it that's basically being wasted until I sacrifice this creature that I don't want to sacrifice. And obviously I'd prefer to have Sadistically on the flyer. I can't remember the exact scenario, but I did not have a way to sacrifice the infestation stage to get the flyer to then put the Glee on it, otherwise I would have done that. But I was a little more aggressive on this day, playing Glees on just creatures just in case things started dying, and it really worked out well. Sadistically was probably the MVP of this entire day. So I'm 5-0 going into the last round. I'm almost always just going to play the match no matter what. I know I had already clinched the top 8, but I just like to play the matches. Luckily, my opponent also wanted to play and did not want to intentionally draw or anything like that. They were on Red Madness. You got to keep in mind they have tons of burn. And if they're playing it right, they're going to be playing mono red control, just trying to kill all of your creatures as much as possible. You also got to kill their pingers pretty much on sight. Otherwise, they're going to deal you way too much damage. And Lava Dart is just a hell of a card against us. It can pick off our growers early, so it can be a real pain to get them down at the right time, and it can just get rid of our fodder, consolidating our counters and then killing those off. I was on the draw. They start with a mountain and just pass. I play a Link Breaker on turn 1. Turn 2, they land a Flame Breather. In my hand, I have a Vampire, 2 Beetles, and a Cursed Marauder. And I have a big choice here. As I just said, you generally want to kill the pingers as soon as possible because they can deal quite a bit of damage. However, I have these 2 Beetles here that could really use the counters from the Marauder. However, if I just throw out the Beetles now with a Link Breaker on board, they're extremely susceptible to a Lava Dart. They could both just be picked off. So I decided to take a very risky line, not necessarily one I would advise, and I play the Vampire with the intention of the following turn playing the Beetles, and then the following turn playing the Marauder. That's giving them 2 full turns with this Flame Breather that I could definitely die to. I don't think I quite mathed out how much time I was giving them at this time, so again, I wouldn't necessarily suggest this line, but I end up playing the Vampire. On their turn, they play a Mountain, grab the prize with like a Faithless Looting or something, ping us for 3 with the Flame Breather. They were playing a little sloppy. They cast the Grab the Prize without discarding a card and suddenly started trying to make us take the damage from Flame Breather and the Grab the Prize. And so I had to correct them to like discard the card first and a couple other things later. But overall, it was not that big of a deal. They left up 1 mana here and couldn't attack in with the Flame Breather, so they just pass it back. We're stuck on 2 swamps, so I do go for the Beetle. They should have done this in response, but they, I think, clearly hadn't played against Mono Black Sack much at all, because their choice was to Lava Dart one of the Beetles, which is not the worst thing ever, but here I get to sacrifice the Link Breaker to the Vampire to grow both Beetles, which I do. I get a Mercenary, and then the Lava Dart goes to the graveyard, and then they flash it back, still on the end step, sacking a Mountain. We take another from the Flame Breather, pinging the same Beetle. So I then sacrifice the Mercenary to get my Beetles to be 3/3s. If the goal here was to use a Lava Dart and a Mountain to get rid of the Link Breaker and the Mercenary, mission accomplished. But it just seemed like the goal was to actually kill a Beetle. Not sure they had quite figured out that's what was going to happen. In any case, I've taken now 5 damage from the Grab the Prize, Lava Dart, and the Flame Breather, so I'm at 15. And on their turn, they play another Grab the Prize, discarding a Fiery Temper. These with the Flame Breather dealing us 7 damage, deciding not to go after the Vampire or the Beetles at this point, which I was pretty happy for. I did think it's possible that I would just die on that turn if they had double Fire Blast, but they didn't, and I was pretty happy to have my Vampire around. Then finally, on my turn 4, I cast the Accursed Marauder. They had no response, so I killed the Flame Breather. Our Beetles became 5/5s, and we cracked in with those and the Vampire for 11 damage, putting them down to 8. I too was at 8, and they had 3 cards in hand and 4 mana or something like that, so they untapped. I was a little worried I was going to die. They cast a Faithless Looting, and once they saw what they drew, they just immediately conceded. Apparently, they did not get what they needed, and we had lethal on board. Game 2, you got to keep in mind, they're going to have still tons and tons of burn, and potentially Electricity or in the festivities, something like that. Again, just being aware that that's a possibility. But to be honest, they kept a sketchy / a little unlucky opening hand of 1 land with a Faithless Looting. They cast that, discarding a Snacker and another looting or something. But turn 2, they did not hit the land. They played a Voldarn Epicure. Turn 3, they didn't hit the land. They used the blood token, looking for another land, still didn't find it. And turn 4, they didn't have a land and they conceded. Which is a real bummer because it put a damper on a really cool play that I had, which was turn 1, Nested Shambler. Turn 2, Sylvike Lifestaff equipped to the Shambler. And turn 3, Stamina onto the Shambler, attack for 4 damage, and then Rite of Consumption my Shambler, pinging them for 4 more, gaining me 4 life, plus 3 for the Life Staff. So I was up to 26, because I'd taken 1 off the Epicure, making 4 Squirrels and a Nested Shambler, and of course then just having a Life Staff to equip to all of them, and just 5 1/1s that was going to finish them off in a few turns. So this isn't the most incredible start ever. They definitely could have won through this if they had a reasonable hand, but if they didn't have some sort of end festivities or board clear, and we had a way to sacrifice even a couple of them to gain some more life with the Life Staff, I think this would have been a really sweet win for us, even if they hadn't just lost to their own deck. So there we go. We are into the top 8 with 6-0. Not only the only player who is undefeated, but also the only player with even 5 match wins. Next highest player was 4-1-1, so I was feeling really good. We did an open decklist top 8, so I immediately knew that my luck had slightly come to an end, and I was playing against the worst matchup for a Black Sack, Grixis Affinity. Why is it the worst deck for us? It's because of Krark Clan Shaman. That plus Death Touch can very easily wipe away our entire board, immediately just losing us the game in many situations. But even if they don't have Death Touch, they can often sacrifice 5 or 6 artifacts to wipe our board anyway, and while that is costly for them, it can be game ending for us, and they can often recover from it in a few turns. Since it was open decklist, I knew exactly how screwed I was going to be. They were playing the normal 3 Krark Clan Shamans, 2 Toxins, and 1 Blowgun, so 3 ways to grant Death Touch. They had the standard 4 Galvanic Blast, but also 2 Cast Downs, so a lot of removal that I have to deal with, and not as problematic, but something I need to keep in mind is they had 4 Reckoner's Bargain, pretty standard, but if I'm going for the win and they have 2 mana up and can gain as much as 7 life off a Mere Enforcer, you got to be aware of that when you're doing some of your math. So definitely going to be an uphill battle. However, I was the first seed, which meant that I got to choose to go first for game 1 without having to roll dice. That didn't stop me from immediately forgetting that and asking if high roll was okay, and then he had to remind me that I actually got to go first. But in any case, I was on the play and had a pretty good opening hand. I just led out turn 1 on a carrion feeder. This is something I often tell people not to do, but it really depends on the context. Grixis Affinity plays a ton of tap lands, and because I knew his deck list, I knew he only had 3 Great Furnaces. That means only 3 ways to Galvanic Blast my carrion feeder on turn 1. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it's just unlikely, and Grixis Affinity is going to win the long game. I need to go as fast as possible, so I wanted to start on turn 1. They indeed play a tap land. Turn 2, I played Nezumi Linkbreaker and Beetle. Then I sacked the Linkbreaker to the feeder and it hit for 2 damage. I wanted to keep the Mercenary around because it can pump my creature, and it can be used for village rights and things like that. They just play a Hunter's Blowgun on turn 2. Turn 3, they hit us with a Refurb. We discard a Swamp, I think. But then we play an Infestation Sage, sacrifice it to the feeder, and I attack for 6 or 8 or something with the feeder and the Beetle. And then I preemptively sadistically onto my Insect token. The reason for this is I already have 2 big creatures on the ground with Carrion Feeder and Beetle. If they don't get a Krark Clan Shaman, I'm probably going to win this game already. They could have some cast downs and stuff, but if not, we're in a very good spot. If they do get the Krark Clan Shaman, I need to have a grower, and that grower has to have flying, which means the only one in the deck is going to be an Insect token with a Sadistic Glee on it. So I do this preemptively. They have a Blowgun on the board, but they don't have the Krark, and then we pass the turn. Well, indeed, they cast Krark Clan Shaman that turn, and not even using the Hunter's Blowgun, they cast Toxin Analysis on the Krark, sacrifice the clue, try to ping off our board. So of course, I sacrifice the Beetle to the feeder, and then the feeder to itself, growing the insect 2 counters, and then the Krark deals 1 damage to itself, gaining a life, and growing the insect again. Now, my opponent did not realize the insect had flying, which could have impacted their play here, though I'm not sure they would have wanted to leave the feeder and the Beetle around anyway, but they did make the indication that they thought the insect was going to die, and I reminded them it has flying, and so it was now a 4/4 flyer. Following turn, I get a Carrion Feeder and a Linkbreaker on board. I attack with the insect, and they take it. I sack the Linkbreaker to make a Mercenary token, and hit them for 5 with the insect. This puts them down to 6, leaving me with a Mercenary, Carrion Feeder, and Sadistic Lead up insect. They don't really do much. I think play a tap land or a Wellspring or something like that, but nothing really changes. They have 1 Refurb to chump block that they've been saving, and they do tap out, I remember that, for I think a Wellspring and a Thoughtcast or something like that. And we top deck another Carrion Feeder, which while unexciting was actually exactly what I needed. My current Carrion Feeder is 2/2 because it's got 1 counter. I pump it with the Mercenary to make it 3 power. Then I can sacrifice the Mercenary, the Carrion Feeder, and the Insect to make it a 6 power creature. Our Insect's already a 5/5, so it'll grow as well. So attacking with both of those, they chump block either one with the Refurb, sacrifice everything to the Carrion Feeder, and I hit them for lethal. Decklist is once again open in sideboarding, and I see that they have an Extract Confession, an Unexpected Fangs, and 2 Breath Weapons. I'm not necessarily expecting the Fangs to come in, but these are the 4 cards that were relevant in some way, removal or life gain, something I needed to think about. And similarly to that hand against Elves, I open a hand that is really bad unless I get a piece of fodder. Bloodthorn Vampire, 2 feeders, an Unearth, and a Rite of Consumption, but 1 piece of fodder, and I could have a turn 4 Bloodthorn Vampire win, something like that. So of course, we keep it, and of course, we don't really end up getting our fodder. So they develop out a Hunter's Blowgun, a Refurb, a Mere Enforcer, and a Krark over the course of 4-ish turns. We have put down two of our carrion feeders and a Bloodthorn Vampire. We have a Snuff Out in hand. I'm holding the Snuff Out in case they ever try to equip the blowgun to the Krark Clan Shaman to prevent it from gaining Death Touch. But I guess just because our creatures were very unimpressive and we didn't have enough fodder, they actually just sacrificed the blowgun to the Krark Clan Shaman to deal 1 damage to our 3 creatures. So I respond by sacrificing the Vampire to a feeder. They let that go, so I get a counter. Then I sacrifice the other feeder to the first feeder. They respond to that by sacrificing another artifact to the Krark Clan Shaman. I think it was a land or something. And then I realize that they've made a bit of a mistake. I let the 1 damage go through. It kills the Krark Clan Shaman. Then I get my counter from the second feeder being sacrificed onto my feeder, and then 1 more damage goes off the Krark. So I have a 3/3 feeder, only taking 2 damage. They realize they made a mistake and say they're really tired, of course. It's been about 7 hours that we've been playing so far. I don't blame them. However, now I'm left with 1 3/3 feeder. They still have an Enforcer and a Refurb. They start attacking for 6. I have to then cast the Snuff Out on the Mirror Enforcer. Hard cast because I've been getting a little flooded. They keep chipping in with the Refurb, and eventually I top deck an Infestation Sage and a Zumi Link Breaker, but they're at 20 life, we're at like 12. They're attacking with the Refurb. I eventually have to Rite of Consumption my own Infestation Sage to make a 1/1 Insect to block the Refurb, which they then cast down our Insect so that we die to the Refurb in a couple more turns. Just another one of those hands that I kept that needed to draw a piece that didn't draw that piece. Honestly, I don't think keeping a hand that needs a piece is always bad. This goes to show that even I might need to be a little more aggressive with my mulligans. Game 3, I have a Mesmeric Fiend in my opening hand, which is really nice because if I can get down feeder into Fiend, I can make sure there's no Krark or Death Touch or whatever I need. I do lead on the feeder, but it actually doesn't feel like just going for the Fiend makes sense right there, partially because I have a Beetle in hand. It doesn't actually feel like I want to just Mesmeric Fiend on turn 2. They could potentially have a lot of card draw that could draw into the Krark afterwards. I also have a Beetle in hand that I want to get a counter on first with the Fiend. So I end up playing a Shambler and maybe some other fodder, but they end up casting down the Carrion Feeder. They also get an Extracted Confession to kill a Feeder or a Beetle at some point. So our Mesmeric Fiend is delayed quite a bit. Eventually we get to the point where I have Bloodthorn Vampire, Beetle, Fiend, and Shambler. Fiend actually in hand. I cast that, sacrifices the Vampire, and I see that their current hand is just Mistvault Bridge, Reckoner's Bargain, and Thoughtcast. I did forget to mention they mulliganed to 5 here. They mulliganed to 5 in both games 2 and 3. Now 2 they got there, but game 3 they mulliganed to 5 again, so a bit rough. And I see their hand is Thoughtcast, Reckoner's Bargain, and a Bridge. I take the Thoughtcast because all they have on board is 3 lands. So if they want to bargain away one of those lands, that's totally fine. I attack them and they go down to 9 life. On their turn, they do end up bargaining away one of their lands, play their Mistvault Bridge, and they're holding up 1 Drossforge Bridge. I have a Bloodthorn Vampire, a Beetle that's a 4/4, and a Nested Shambler. They pass to me, and so with those 3 cards, I top deck a Swamp, nothing in hand. I could sacrifice the Shambler to the Vampire, and then I could sacrifice the Squirrel, and we could hit in for 11 damage and just kill them right there. However, if they have, with their 1 red mana, a Galvanic Blast, which they didn't just draw 1 card that I haven't seen, they drew 3 because of the bargain, so there's a very large chance they could have drawn that. If I sacrifice to the Shambler, they could then target the Beetle, because it's currently a 4/4, with the Galvanic Blast. I could sack the Vampire, but then the Beetle is susceptible the following turn, and I'm not dealing lethal this turn. Or they could kill the Vampire. The Beetle is going to be big and deal quite a bit of damage, but they still go to like 2 or 3. They can easily claw back from that and even get some removal for the Beetle. I don't really see a need to go for it here. They're going to 3. They're going to be dead regardless next turn. And I said my hand was empty. I forgot this part. I have a Snuff Out in hand, so if they get a Krark, I can prevent Death Touch from it. They only have like 3 lands on board. I could probably keep my Beetle alive and win the game that way. So I don't end up going for it. I deal them 6 damage. They go down to 3. They draw something useless, pass the turn, I attack for lethal. And then they inquire about why I didn't just kill them the previous turn, and I explain my reasoning. I think it made sense at the time, and in retrospect, I wouldn't have changed anything. By now, there was a massive storm raging outside. It had dropped to about 10 degrees. Tons of wind, snow. People who had just left the shop were texting and telling people that they got in accidents. For those of us who were driving a couple hours to get back home, definitely a bit unsettling, but there was work still to be done. In the semifinals, I played against Black Sack, the only other person playing Black Sack at the event. We'd actually talked a little bit previously. Apparently they played Black Sack after seeing some of my videos, so they're a fan, which I appreciate. And they also made it to top 4, so 2 Black Sacks in the top 4 was very exciting. The thing to know about the mirror match is that Mortician Beetle is king. Mortician Beetle grows after either player sacrifices a creature, so having just 1 on the board can grow so much quicker than it generally would, because your whole game plan revolves around sacrificing your own creatures, which means keeping a hand with a beetle or trying to find it, keep it alive, is really a strong plan. Now, since it was open deck lists, I also saw that they had a few changes from my main list. They were running 2 Ghoul Caller's Chance, an Escape Tunnel, a Bone Picker, and an extra Corrupted Conviction, as well as 3 Accursed Marauders. So no drastic changes, but I needed to watch out for the Escape Tunnel, trying even more to not drop to a low enough life total to die to a Rite of Consumption or to an Escape Tunnel out of nowhere, and be a little weary of the Ghoul Caller's Chance, getting them tons of extra value. I went first and just started with a Link Breaker, and they immediately played a Beetle. Now these decks, and obviously they had my deck list too, so they knew I wasn't going to have a ton of removal in my deck, but leading out on a Beetle is extremely risky because I could have a Shambling Ghast and sacrifice it to a Village Rites or Carrion Feeder to pick off the Beetle. Now I would need to sacrifice it in their upkeep because then the trigger goes on the stack atop the Beetle trigger, but it's something I could do, or I could just have an Accursed Marauder, which is exactly what I had. I had some other plans of what I wanted to do, but killing a Beetle was paramount, so I cast the Accursed Marauder, sacrificed my Link Breaker, and kept the Marauder around when they had to lose their Beetle. Now the game proceeded on for quite a while. Unfortunately, I never saw a Beetle the entire game, and they found a second one, putting it down, playing their own Accursed Marauder, which picked off some of my fodder, but they ended up unearthing it, and then later Ghoul Caller's Chanting to pick it and the Shambling Ghast up. All I had on board was a Nested Shambler, a Mercenary, and a Carrion Feeder, so they were able to play the Shambling Ghast, sacrifice it to pick off our Shambler, we sacked it in response to get our Squirrel, then they played the Marauder, killed our Carrion Feeder. Their Beetle was about a 9/9 at this point. I jump blocked for several turns, trying to stay ahead of a Rite of Consumption, but eventually just ran out of creatures to even block and died to the Beetle even without it being flung. A bit unfortunate of a start, but I kind of liked my position in our post-sideboard games for one main reason. Their sideboard consisted of only 1 Tragic Slip. Now they had a couple Snuff Outs and Spinning Darkness, but those are not going to hit our black creatures, so just 1 Tragic Slip plus the Accursed Marauders in the main deck, we're not going to be able to do the best job at killing our growers as long as we could play around the removal effectively, whereas we get to side in 3 Tragic Slips, 3 Mesmeric Fiends, and a couple Rotten Reunions. Now this varies a little bit from my sideboard guide, because to be honest, I don't have my sideboard guide fully memorized, so sometimes I just sideboard things in the moment, and sometimes I'm trying things out to see if I need to update my own guide. So my guide technically says to do 2 Mesmeric Fiends and 2 Tragic Slips in exchange for 2 Snuff Outs and 2 Accursed Marauders. But I have 3 Tragic Slips, and I figured why not throw in 3 Mesmeric Fiends, and I specifically brought in the Reunions when I usually wouldn't, because they had not only Unearths and Staminas, but also the Ghoul Caller's Chance. I figured there was probably going to be an opportunity to get some value from it then. So I brought out those Marauders and Stuff Outs, and then brought out all 4 of the Infestation Sages, because I figured these cards would be more valuable. In game 2, I lead with like a Nezumi Link Breaker or something, and they play a Carrion Feeder on turn 1. Again, I'm not 100% sure what their hand is. Sometimes it's okay to lead on a feeder, but this can be very susceptible to removal. For example, I just cast a Tragic Slip without even having Morbid to kill the feeder right away. Obviously, Tragic Slip's probably going to be able to kill the growers most times no matter what, but you still want to try to make your opponent have to jump through the hoop of sacrificing a creature that they otherwise might not want to. I got a Beetle and a couple pieces of fodder on the board, and then I had a Vampire, and I cast this Mesmeric Fiend in order to sacrifice it to the Vampire, grow a Mortician Beetle, and take a look at their hand. Now by then they had another Carrion Feeder and a Nezumi Link Breaker on board, and they sacrificed the Link Breaker to the Carrion Feeder and then cast Tragic Slip on our Vampire so that we wouldn't have a way to sacrifice the Mesmeric Fiend. A pretty smart play, but not executed perfectly. Tragic Slip gives -1/-1, and then if any creature has died from either of us, it gives -13/-13 instead. They can just target this on the Vampire, just as -1/-1, which would kill the Vampire, and if I try to grow it in response, sacrificing a creature, then it's actually going to make the Morbid go off for the Tragic Slip, which will instead kill the Vampire. So they didn't need to preemptively sacrifice their Link Breaker, so they wasted a little bit of fodder here. In addition, while they did keep us from sacrificing the Mesmeric Fiend, they used the only 1 Tragic Slip that I know they have in their entire deck, so now suddenly I don't have to fear any of their removal the whole game. I'm not saying that alone is a mistake, but knowing that it's their only piece of removal, it might be worth holding on to for a little bit longer. Then again, I was going to Mesmeric Fiend here, and I could have taken the Tragic Slip, so I'm not saying it was wrong to cast it here, just that it really worked out for me knowing that there wasn't going to be another removal spell to follow it. So the Fiend didn't get sacrificed, but I saw an Escape Tunnel, a Village Rites, and a Spinning Darkness. They actually had a black mana up, and I think should have cast the Village Rites in response. Now, since they had just sacrificed the Nezumi Link Breaker, maybe they didn't want to lose their only other fodder with the Mercenary, or maybe they just thought I would take something else from them with the Fiend. But taking the Village Rites here just shuts off their hand entirely. In their defense, they sided in Spinning Darkness because they didn't realize it said non-black creature, so they later tried to cast this on a Mortician Beetle. I had to remind them that it cannot target that, and they eventually used it on a mercenary instead, but they realized and they cited it out for game 3. But because they didn't really have any other removal in their deck, they were never able to get that village rights back. They top decked a little poorly, and we were able to end up just beating them down with a bunch of squirrels and a Bloodthorn Vampire, their one mercenary and carrion feeder not being able to block very effectively. So we moved on to game 3, and once again, they led out with a beetle turn 1, and I tragic slipped it right away. Again, slip's probably going to hit a beetle at some point regardless, so maybe it wasn't a big deal, but of course I'm going to take that 1-for-1 trade when the beetle's the most important card in the deck. Now I apologize here, I can't remember everything that happened in the interim, but I remember the ending board state in the last couple turns of the game, so let me set the scene here. They end up drawing another one of their beetles, me never having seen one in our entire match, and they put a Sadistic Glee onto it as well. It currently has 4 +1/+1 counters, being a 5/5 total. I have my own creature with a Sadistic Glee on it, Infestation Sage, as well as 1 squirrel, a carrion feeder with 1 +1/+1 counter, and a treasure I had gotten from a Shambling Ghast. In my hand, I have a Rotten Reunion that I'm just waiting to use, and they give me a perfect target. I'm tapped out except for my treasure, which hides a little bit that I'm holding something up, and they go for an Unearth on the Marauder, which would not only grow their beetle, but either eat our Carrion Feeder or our Infestation Sage, which is looking to grow quite a bit. So definitely not something I really want to happen. This obviously lets me just crack my treasure, cast the Rotten Reunion to exile the Marauder, and make a 2/2 zombie. This was their only card in hand, so this ends up being really effective, and their Mortician Beetle just stays back at home. I draw a swamp and just pass, with a Rotten Reunion up in our graveyard, and on their turn, they cast a Drown in Sorrow. This is a card they mentioned in sideboarding after game 1, saying, how do we feel about siding in Drown in Sorrow? And I laughed and said I would happily tell them how I felt about it after the match was over. They also then said at the end of the match that they only sided in one of their Drown in Sorrows and they happened to draw it, and they cast it right here. And I was in a very precarious spot. I had to think everything out very carefully. I usually take a little bit of time to think things out, but I try not to take too long. But I realized we're in the semifinals. This is definitely going to be one of the last couple turns. I needed to just take a moment to really think this out, because I was at 10 life here, and I believe my Infestation Sage was tapped. I said they left the beetle back at home, but it's possible they had attacked me and I attacked back with the Infestation Sage and the Carrion Feeder. In any case, I had a squirrel to block and my zombie cannot. But the Drown in Sorrow is obviously going to kill the squirrel, so if the beetle gets big enough to kill me, I will lose the game. Now, I'm at 10 life and they're at 14, and so after doing some thinking, I realize I can sacrifice the zombie to get a counter to both my Sage and my Carrion Feeder. Now, this grows the beetle by 2 counters, because I sacrificed a creature and a creature died, but I do that anyway, and then I sacrifice the squirrel for the same thing, counter here, 2 counters on the beetle. This grows our feeder and our Sage big enough to survive the Drown in Sorrow, and their beetle becomes a 9/9, actually shrunk by 2 by the Drown in Sorrow, which is not lethal hitting us. They end up attacking with the Mortician Beetle anyway, which was a great sign for me. They probably should have left it back to block, seeing as they did not have lethal damage, because they dealt me 7, putting me to 3, but leaving themselves quite open. On their end step, I flashed back the Rotten Reunion, which gave me a creature to sacrifice to the feeder, growing the Sage to a 4/4, the feeder to a 5/5, allowing me to attack in for 9 damage. They were at 14, so dropped down to 5, and then I had the Rite of Consumption in hand that I'd held for a couple of turns. I was able to fling my feeder and win the game just barely. It was a really close game, and if they had held back the beetle, it's possible that I still would have top decked a removal spell or more fodder to pump my creatures big enough or what have you. But definitely attacking on that turn when they weren't winning was a lot more dangerous. Maybe they weren't giving me credit for the Rite of Consumption, but even just a double body creature would have just about done it too. In any case, we end up taking the match, going on to the finals, and I see the other semifinals match is Jund Wildfire versus the Red Madness player I had already played against, so I would be playing against one of those two. However, the storm had not died down, it had gotten quite a bit worse, and the store owner called the head judge, saying that he wanted the event to be ended after the current round. The head judge came over to me and asked if I was waiting on anybody to leave. I came with one other buddy who had unfortunately not made the top 8, so I said no, and so he handed me a tropical island. Without playing the finals, I was a little perplexed and asked, how does this work? And he showed me a second tropical island and said the Badlands was no longer on the table. Both of the finalists would instead receive the tropical island so that the event could end early. This was a really nice move from the store owner and the head judge, not only prioritizing our safety getting home, but even going so far as to up the prizes a little bit to allow us to go home early. I did have to ask the head judge, so for bragging rights, who won the event? To which he said, you're the first seed and the only undefeated player, so I guess that makes it you. Which felt pretty good after going 8-0. And it was pretty nice not having to play the finals because our drive home did take an extra 45 minutes with me driving extremely slowly as to not end up in a ditch. This was a really fun event. I'm glad I was able to make it. Even if I hadn't done so well in the event, it was just really fun to have such a wide spread of decks. I did not play against a duplicate deck at all, 8 different decks. And assuming I had played against Jund in the finals, that would have been 9 different decks that I played against total. Thanks again to Through the Decades for putting on the event. I'm trying to make it to more in-person events, so ideally I'll make it to more Pauper events in the Midwest near where I live within a couple of hours. And I might even do some more reports like this if there's anything worth reporting. Please let me know if you enjoyed this video because I'm not really sure if it just comes off super boring or if there's anything I could do to improve it. I also played in a tournament about a month ago that I did pretty well at. I almost made a video report for that tournament and then found that it was kind of boring, me just rehashing everything, which is why I made the presentation to hopefully be a little bit more entertaining. But if people would want to hear about that event, I'd be happy to brag on myself a little bit more. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.